about our ideas, as well as our team. I'm from a consulting firm, women-owned consulting firm in Denver, Root Policy. We and Brian's staff helped develop a really nice research page, which has a number of different perspectives on housing policy, and we think is really useful. And for those of you who are younger or just love podcasts, our millennial age staff put some podcasts on there as well. So it speaks to everybody. Go ahead and go forward, Brian. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about, just share some data, really limited on the affordability crisis. I think this is something that we are all aware of, although it touches every community a bit differently. I'll talk a little bit about CHAP, and then I'm going to turn this over to Brian to speak to our platform and goals and proposals. And then we'll have an opportunity for you all to ask us some questions. So I think that particularly in your part of the state, it's very appropriate to call the situation a crisis. Colorado now ranks as the third least affordable state in the nation. And this is a comparison of median income to median home sales prices. There's a lot of reasons that housing's unaffordable and continues to grow in lack of affordability. I'll talk about those in just a moment. But the big one is that median incomes, particularly of service workers and some industries, healthcare, education, that are really important to our economy, those incomes are just not going up, and housing costs are. A 2019 survey showed that several categories of essential workers can't afford to rent or own the median priced home, and that is true of most of Colorado's metropolitan areas. Rural areas have a little bit of a different dynamic. They have even more of, I would say, this double whammy in that incomes aren't growing. They have a lot of trouble attracting labor, and they can't, produce housing like some urban areas have the ability to produce just out of, they don't have volume builders. Costs are very high. Just kind of when we think about what the effects are from an employment perspective, these effects are very real. You see these in other communities. Go ahead and go forward, Brian, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the research in just a moment. So these graphics, these are statewide graphics, and this shows the change in median income, 63% between 2000 and 2019. That's not a lot compared to median gross rent, which has increased over 100%, and the median home value, which has risen over almost 150%. I would, caution on the median home value. This is the data out of the census, so it's not reflecting homes that are on the market, that are listed or for sale. As you all are probably very aware, that market's very tight right now. And so I would say that this median home value increase is a little bit generous in terms of it implies a higher level of affordability. It's looking at the entire housing stock, not what's on the market for sale. The one piece I think that always surprises people, particularly those in fast-growing communities, when we look at the distribution of housing units by type, and this compares 2000 to 2019, the state's grown a lot over that period, mostly in the current decade. So growth between 2000 and 2010 was not very fast. We've been growing at a pace in the last 10 years that's pretty equivalent to how we grew in the 1990s, which was another high growth period. But even given all of this growth, we look a lot in terms of distribution of housing type like we always have. And so even though it feels like people are putting up apartment complexes on every corner of your city, kind of in the grand scheme of things, it's really not shifting distribution of housing type very much. And we see this in all parts of the state. Go ahead and go forward. Another nuance to what's happening is if you look at broad cost burden numbers, and cost burden is defined as paying more than 30% of one's gross household income in housing costs. When we look at the shift in cost burden, overall, it's gone down a little bit, and that's because of this infusion of high-income households. So when a high-income household moves into a community, they can generally afford the rent or the median home price, and they're typically not cost burdened. And if they replace people who are lower income, who are cost burdened, then that lowers cost burden overall. But when we break this apart by income category, you see that it actually has shifted, and it's shifted into what we call middle market households. So this is cost burden renters by income comparing 2010 to 2019. Very unfortunately, people who are earning less than $20,000 a year have always been heavily cost burdened, and we see that those numbers really haven't changed. Where we see a big change is in 35 to 50 and 50 to 75,000, and even the 75 to 100,000 has gone up. And so that tells us that this is becoming a missing middle and middle market problem. Couldn't go forward. I have an economist on staff who loves to do these projections, and she took the experience of the last 10 years and projected that forward just to see what does that mean in terms of where we're going. The kind of orangish figure or line on the bottom shows median income. So if things from 2010, if increases continue, incomes don't really go up much relative to median home value, which has just increased dramatically and would continue to increase dramatically. So this is a bit of a sad story if things are to continue. Couldn't go forward. So on our website, we have a really nice research page. I'm proud of it because our staff helped develop it, but it gives a lot of information about, and it's mostly academic in nature. A lot of academics have started to look at the consequences of unaffordable housing. Some of the really big takeaways that actually surprised me, some economists have started to study pretty closely distortions in labor markets and economic growth associated with lack of affordable housing. And so those numbers are pretty big. I'll talk about those in just a moment. I think we can all acknowledge that distorting development and incentivizing suburban sprawl does have costs, environmental costs, not only in terms of increasing traffic, leaning heavily on water and sewer infrastructure. It just costs more over time to public sector to grow in that way. And then finally, and I don't want to understate this at all, but lower income families, particularly racial and ethnic minority groups, as they're pushed further and further out in communities, further away from their work, from what we call high opportunity areas where there's a lot of employment, where there are good schools, that just perpetuates the cycle of low access to opportunity and perpetuates a cycle of poverty. I can go forward. Just a couple of points of the research that I wanted to emphasize. Some economists have concluded that unaffordable housing can slow employment growth by 1 to 2% per year. There was one study that looked at lack of affordable housing in very, very high cost cities like San Jose and determined that increasing the housing supply in these three areas, so providing human capital in areas where businesses need it, could increase the GDP by 9%. So these are real economic costs. I also wanted to acknowledge, even though anti-displacement efforts are not a core part of our platform, but we do really care about these, that acknowledge that increasing the supply overall does help reduce displacement, and thinking very strategically about housing supply relative to displacement is something we certainly support. And go forward. So, a bit about Colorado's land use regulatory system. I think you all know this, we're very big on local control here, and local governments are free to plan and regulate land use without the interference of state government. Compared to other states, most states place more constraints on local discretion in the area of planning and zoning, so we're pretty loose in that regard. When we think about, step back and look at how this system affects housing affordability, there's really sort of a disparate impact depending on how a community decides to behave in terms of growth. So local governments that enact affordability measures, it's going to have more limited impact when we look at, kind of that affordability and housing supply is really a regional problem. So when local governments behave differently, that distorts the market, much like I've talked about how some of these high cost markets and their behavior has distorted economic growth at the national level. Thanks, Brian. I wanted to just give you a couple of examples, and some of these you may recognize. They're not really specific to any one area, but things that we as a group have experienced. Brian will talk about, his role and I was a member of Denver Planning Board for a couple of years, and I certainly saw some of this firsthand. So, public opposition is pretty real and very strong. You could see a planning board deny a parking variance, which can halt development of affordable housing project, which I think a lot of data are showing. Affordable housing, typically very, very affordable housing, doesn't need as much parking as market rate housing. In terms of growth limitations, some of the impacts that we expect and that we're already seeing with growth limitations is that if you can't grow housing, you're going to be forcing, and we've seen this over many decades in certain parts of the state, you're forcing that residential solution to your employment growth onto other communities. And then finally, I think that when you step back and think about the impact on infrastructure costs and community opposition, again, you're forcing that infrastructure costs into certain communities when you're not able to accommodate demand within your city or county. Go ahead and go forward. So I'm going to pause a little bit and tell you a bit about who we are. Joe gave a bit of an introduction, and then I'll turn it over to Brian to talk about our platform. We are volunteers. Nobody is paying us. We're a group of folks who have been colleagues in terms of we've presented together on these topics for many, many years. We have different backgrounds. Some of us are academics. Some are consultants like I am and housing economists. Others represent developers. Some are urban planners. And we've been talking about this for many, many years when we come together to do presentations and thought, why don't we put together our best ideas? These ideas, the platform is contributed from all of us, and we have a little bit of a different viewpoint in terms of how to solve affordable housing. We put those ideas together and we created CHAP. What we do is we compile and disseminate relevant research. We're out on the road a lot, if you will, educating community members, talking to folks like you about these ideas, and really advocating for legislation to promote and preserve the development of affordable housing. So at the end of the day, we really think our platform could make a really big dent in the affordable housing crisis in Colorado and in local communities. Go forward. What we're not, but what we still care about, we're not advocating for public funding for low-income housing development, addressing homelessness, advocating for tenants' rights or rent controls, or housing quality improvements. We recognize that those are very dire needs in some communities, but that's just not where our sweet spot is in terms of what we're experienced in. Go forward. And just a bit about who we are. I'm Heidi Agler. I run a women-owned consulting firm in Denver, and we do housing market studies and strategic plans for cities and states, and we work throughout the country. Erin Clark is one of our members. She works for Urban Land Conservancy. They buy land and develop transit-oriented development. I'll let Brian introduce himself as I turn it over to him. Susan Daggett is part of our team. She runs the Rocky Mountain Land Use Institute, whose conference is going on this month and is excellent. She's also a professor at the University of Denver. She's a law professor. Don Elliott is one of our colleagues who Brian and I have presented with many, many times over the years. He's a director of Clarion Associates. Like Brian, he's a planner and a lawyer. And then Sean Malley works with CRL Associates. They represent developer interests to cities. Go ahead and go forward. And just a bit of why this approach. I've talked a lot about how the housing market is regional. In nature, it doesn't really stop, and certainly employment doesn't stop at city or county boundaries. So when we look at how interconnected metropolitan areas function, you don't keep your jobs and your housing to yourself. You're sharing those impacts with your neighbors, and we think that our platform helps equalize some of the distortions that have happened by how communities behave. We've also, shown that addressing policy responses early on can help mitigate some of the high costs that happen over time. I think there's pretty good evidence that Colorado's current system has not produced an adequate response, that more needs to be done. And it doesn't appear that there's any waning interest in people moving here, in employment growing. And so we think the time is now to act. Go forward. And with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Brian, and he can introduce himself and talk about what we're up to in terms of our platform.
Great, thanks, Heidi. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see some of you again, and it's nice to see some new faces as well. I'm Brian Connolly. I am a land use planner and lawyer with the law firm of Otten Johnson. We're based in Denver. We work throughout the state on land use and real estate matters. I would say we primarily represent landowners and developers in our work, although we certainly have served in special counsel roles for municipalities and counties as well. Heidi did a good job of sort of, I think, setting the stage for what we've been working on. Part of what, as Heidi said, our goal is research, education, and advocacy. And on the advocacy piece, the way we sort of went about this is we decided that to sort of get the conversation going in many ways, that we were going to put a platform out and just, again, kind of cobbling together ideas that have come from all of our various experiences on the working group. Taking those and put them out into the world and see, kind of go on what we're calling a listening tour or speaking tour like we're doing right now, and gather input and feedback, and hopefully continue to advance the conversation around housing affordability in the state. And so our goal, our overarching goal, I would say, is removing regulatory barriers to the development of affordable forms of housing. So in some ways, what you're going to see is a deregulatory platform, but trying to do so in a way that doesn't cost additional money for our governmental entities, and it would have application in the places that are fastest growing in the state, and really allow for the private market to deliver more affordable forms of housing. Again, we're not really talking about the ultra low income type housing that really needs public subsidy. We're talking about how can the private market create more affordable forms of housing. So we put our platform into three buckets. The first is making land available for the development of more affordable forms of housing. And second is elevating housing as part of municipal planning and decision making. And the third is addressing resource constraints. I should have also noted that because all of us come from a land use planning kind of background and we focus mostly on those issues, our platform right now is really aimed at how to address problems or perceived problems, at least from our standpoint, in the municipal planning and regulation of land use as it relates to housing development. So we're not really talking about financing tools. We're not talking about again, public housing programs, things like that. This is really about land use and zoning, and how we facilitate better development of housing. So walking through our proposals, we have 8 policy proposals that we put out into the world. The first one deals with accessory dwelling units. Allowing accessory dwelling units by right in agricultural, single family, and 2-family zone districts throughout the higher population areas of the state. There's really good research out there that says that accessory dwelling units are a good way of producing more affordable housing. They have fairly limited impact on community character. They place fairly limited demand on public infrastructure. They offer an opportunity for landowners to get a return on having accessory dwelling units, but they also are an affordable form of housing. And we see people like teachers and firefighters, police officers renting accessory dwelling units. Questions that we get on this proposal relate to, well, what if we're in a water short county? How do we deal with accessory dwelling units there? Nothing about our proposal is saying that you can't require an accessory dwelling unit to have adequate water supply. Also, nothing about our proposal is saying that a local government can't regulate the appearance of accessory dwelling units or the size of accessory dwelling units. We think those are things that are appropriately sort of in local government's wheelhouse. And another question we've gotten is, well, what do you do about short-term rentals if accessory dwelling units are just going to be used for short-term rentals? Again, that's something that's well within the power of local government to address, is to determine whether or not accessory dwelling units can be used as short-term rentals and how they can be used as such. Our second proposal looks at transit-oriented development. This is not as much of a Northern Colorado issue, since you don't really have fixed rail transit or bus rapid transit right now. But requiring cities that have fixed rail or bus rapid transit stations to allow higher density development, 25 dwelling units per acre on properties within 1/8 of a mile of a station. The average American spends 13% of income on transportation. And so transportation is a big piece of the puzzle when it comes to cost of living and housing affordability. And there's certainly a lot of opportunity, particularly in the Denver metro area, to allow more residential development near transit stations. We have, although some jurisdictions have zoned for residential development around transit stations, there are many others that have not. And so we're not taking advantage of that resource that we have. Our third proposal looks at allowing for medium density housing in all communities of a certain size. And so 10 dwelling units per acre and at least 10% of the land area of a city or town. When we're talking about 10 dwelling units per acre, we're really talking about kind of townhouse, row house type development. We're not talking about high density development. If you think back to the chart that Heidi showed on like our third slide, that shows the distribution of housing units, where you see where we're really short is on the so-called missing middle housing, right? That type of housing that's between apartments and single family homes that are maybe those starter homes for people to be able to afford as a first time home purchase, places for people to downsize to sort of age in place. And then also just that those are more affordable forms of generally for sale housing. So looking at zoning more land for medium density housing, we think is really important. We don't have a lot of land zoned for it right now. The fourth proposal looks at growth limitations. Again, not something that, at least to my knowledge, has come to Northern Colorado yet, but we've got several jurisdictions around the metro area that have enacted growth limitations that say we're only going to grow by 1% per year in the number of housing units we have. Golden, Lakewood, Boulder all have those types of limitations. We really think those are inappropriate in a state that's growing as quickly as we are, that if as one community shuts its door to growth, that just pushes out the obligation to every other community in the area to deal with the consequences of growth. We think those are inappropriate and those should be preempted at the state level. Our fifth proposal looks at parking requirements. So as Heidi said, parking requirements have proven to be challenging, particularly for deed restricted affordable housing. So reducing parking requirements for deed restricted affordable housing is really important. We've seen several examples of affordable projects that have failed because of parking requirements. And parking is expensive, right? So if you're a developer and you got to pay for putting parking in, if you're talking about surface parking, you're $5,000 to $10,000 a space, and if you're talking about structured parking, it's $25,000 or $30,000 a space. That really affects the capital stack of an affordable project, and so looking at ways to reduce those parking requirements, we think is really important. Our sixth proposal, so pivoting a little bit to the elevating housing as part of planning and decision making in the state, Colorado does not require local governments to evaluate housing need as part of land use planning. And so when we produce comprehensive plans, master plans, there are several Colorado jurisdictions that really don't look at growth projections, don't look at housing needs. They're just sort of planning in the vacuum and saying, we want growth in certain places, we don't want growth in other places. We think that as a matter of rational policy making, you have to understand what your housing need is if you're going to be able to develop a well-informed land use plan. So our sixth proposal is at having local governments as part of producing comprehensive plans, master plans, evaluating housing need and incorporating housing need and how to meet that housing need into future planning efforts. We think that's really important in terms of informing good local policy around housing. Our seventh proposal looks at approval criteria. So for those of you who have been involved with zoning approvals or land use approvals for development, you know that generally speaking, when a development comes to a city council or a planning commission or a board of county commissioners, it needs to meet certain criteria for approval. There are legal criteria. There can be evaluating the availability of infrastructure, can be evaluating more subjective things like character and harmony and compatibility. We think that in order for housing development to be more predictable, driving those conversations more to the comprehensive planning process. So when Fort Collins undertakes a comprehensive plan, talking about where housing should go and where it should be located, having those conversations at the planning stage is a lot more productive than having them in the context of a public hearing about a particular housing project. And so when we're talking about things like community character or compatibility or harmony in a public hearing, that's an opportunity for more subjectivity to be entered into the process. Whereas if we were having those conversations at the planning stage and then relying on those comprehensive plans as we proceed through development approvals, that would lead to more consistency, more predictability, and would allow local governments to actually achieve those outcomes without giving really NIMBY or anti-development opposition voice in talking about issues of community character at that late stage. Finally, our eighth proposal deals with inclusionary zoning. As I think probably many of you know, there's a bill going through the Colorado legislature right now that would allow for local governments to require, at least with respect to rental development, allow local governments to require rental projects to set aside a certain percentage of units as affordable. We support that bill. That being said, we think that there are ways that that bill could be improved, particularly in the area of providing financial offsets and flexibility for developer compliance. So making sure that we're not imposing so much cost on development such that it would either not produce affordable units or not produce housing units at all. That's obviously something that is a risk of a poorly designed inclusionary housing ordinance. And so we're trying to avoid that risk. The other thing that I think we're focused on too is making sure that local governments that are adopting inclusionary housing ordinances are doing so in light of housing needs analysis, making sure that they understand that you're not going to get the ultra low income housing units out of inclusionary housing ordinances. You're going to get middle income type housing, workforce type housing, but making sure that it's tailored to housing need, we think is really important. So the intended consequences of what our platform is allow more opportunities for the private market to deliver needed missing middle housing supply, creating more efficient housing supply, reducing the cost of providing deemed restricted affordable housing, and then addressing information gaps that we have in our present planning processes. Displacement's an issue that comes up. It's one that's probably more significant in the Denver metro area than it is maybe in some of the northern Colorado communities. We don't think that our platform necessitates displacement. And in fact, we think that by allowing more housing supply, we avoid displacement of existing residents. And more importantly, we think that issues of displacement are ones that need to be dealt with on local and even the neighborhood level. It's very hard to design a policy response to displacement at the state level. So what we're looking to do right now, we are having these conversations. We are looking forward to hearing your ideas and questions. We're looking for supporters to be listed on our website. We are looking to continue our speaking tour and listening tour. And so if you have groups that you think will be interested in hearing what we're working on, we'd love to talk to them. We're looking for data and research. We're working on a white paper right now that's going to talk about this platform and sort of provide more support for the platform from a data perspective. And so any data or research you have is really helpful. And then we're looking for advocacy for affordable housing at both the state and local levels. This is, we're talking about state level legislation, but we certainly realize that there's a lot that can be done at the local level to address these things. This is our contact information. And so please feel free to reach out. And with that, I will stop screen sharing and would love to take questions and have some conversation.
Great. Well, I appreciate both of that, Brian and Heidi. That's very informative. So what would help me out, because I'm less adept at technology than some of you, I'm sure, it would be helpful if you have questions, just raise your hand. And that way you kind of jump up to the top of my screen, so I'd be sure to see you. So I know there was a lot of discussion in the chat, so I'll expect some of you will want to address those questions. Let's start with you, Sean.
I want to thank you guys for the presentation today. I like the numbers of ideas that you have. The thing that I think is missing is how to get there. How do we get past the NIMBYism? How do we get a change in the municipality's leadership to allow for objective decisions made upon policy and not upon pitchforks and torches brought to council meetings? I didn't hear the how.
Yeah, I'd be happy to start with a response, Sean. happy St. Patrick's Day week to a fellow Irishman. Yeah, I think so. It's a great question, and one of the reasons that we're looking at this from a state legislation perspective is precisely because of what you mentioned, right? That there's the local leaders. I mean, we hear a lot from local elected officials that, you know, we need affordable housing in our community. We are trying to do everything we can to produce affordable housing. But what happens, I think, more often than, you know, we'd like to admit, is that when push comes to shove, when we get into the hearing room where you know, a housing application is before a local city council, it's really hard for local officials to sort of overcome, you know, the NIMBYism and to make a decision that, while perhaps good for the whole community, is not politically fraught because of you know, the volume of what's going on in front of them. This is in fact why many states that have faced affordable housing crises like ours have taken state level approaches to at least try to even the playing field among municipalities, because then, I mean, you know, a local elected official can say, well, you know, yes, we hear you, but we actually have an obligation from the state that tells us to provide more housing. Now, you know, obviously the local control ethos that we have here, I mean, that is a hurdle that we will need to get over, and that we're working on getting over in our conversations with state leaders and local leaders as well, by the way. There are local leaders who have said, yeah, we support a platform like this, even though we know it might, you know, cut away a little bit at local control. You know, we support this because we think this is the right thing to do. So, I mean, that is why we're looking at this from the state level, is that the NIMBYism is it's really hard to overcome at the local level. And so taking these, you know, locality by locality approaches to responding to this crisis, it just doesn't get done, because what happens is the room gets packed with the NIMBYs, and then the, you know, the notion of providing or easing zoning regulation sort of goes out the window.
Appreciate that, Brian. And I'm glad that you're taking this route. Hopefully this can gain some traction. A couple of thoughts. I apologize, I came in just a little bit late, but I did get to see your chart for the expectations for median home sale prices by 2040. But I'd really like to know what you base that on. It felt like you're basing that on the past 5 years of trajectory. And I believe that it would be a lot more accurate if we based it upon the last 20 years of trajectory, because the last 5 years have been truly an anomaly in my opinion, and not a good one at that. And then the last piece I will add is that I'm not speaking for anyone else, just for myself. Inclusionary zoning, I believe, is I don't believe that it's a good tool to move forward with. I believe being able to incent developers to produce attainable and affordable and lower priced housing to approve different projects, yes, that is good. And that can be accomplished in any of a number of ways: land trusts, deed restrictions, et cetera. But if you're going to force inclusionary zoning, I believe it's going to harm the housing that will be built.
And Sean, I can take the comment about the data. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Like, we were doing this at a, you know, sort of worst case scenario. So when we do forecasts, we look at that. What if things do continue like they have in the last 5 years, like developers think they might? What might that look like? And so it is, you know, I would say a more dire scenario than what maybe looking at the past 20 years would suggest. It's not a real sophisticated forecasting model. And on inclusionary, we do a lot of the economic feasibility that helps inform, you know, policies, not only inclusionary potentially, but also like density bonuses. And so we're talking to developers quite a bit. We're doing some work in Denver right now. And I would say, you know, I think the flaw working around the country, and I see this in, you know, in some states that actually think that they're doing good by getting real specific in terms of what they'll allow cities to do or not do, even from an incentives package. My position from doing a lot of economic feasibility is that if you're overly prescriptive, then you're not letting a local market react to their individual needs. And so I don't think we're saying everybody needs to have inclusionary zoning, but we're saying inclusionary zoning for rental units should be allowed, and let the local government figure that out if that's appropriate for their market.
Fair enough on that. Thanks.
Mr. Horak.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for, again, Sean's comment, I think, is really a strong one about the how. And I know you're supposedly going to state legislation. I'm just saying, somebody involved in local government previously and hopefully in the future, I don't think that's the answer. I think that's like the broad brush answer for everybody. And to try to fool the people by having it pass the state level, I don't think is very honest or very straightforward. I do think some of the ideas there, like your inclusionary zone, I think you ought to talk about one of the tools where that's easily done by local governments because of the statute that you can do it under. A metro district, residential metro districts can have requirements for whatever under the different criteria, one of which is housing that can go in there. The 8120, below 80, whatever the local jurisdiction has in their criteria can be done. That's a way the developer has an incentive, the financing, and then how that's paid for to do that. So I think that's one that's better than just saying inclusionary zoning, because inclusionary zoning is a very controversial and not something that folks want to do. And it basically, a developer would say, just adds cost to the project because somebody's got to make up the subsidy differential. The other one is, have you looked at anything where communities in Colorado or across the nation have taken, most projects are opposed because people already live around them in some way, shape, or form. That's the opposition. Projects are never opposed where hardly anybody lives around them. We have a project in Fort Collins called The Ponds, very nice place. Sean lived there. It's got a lot of natural areas and all that. That project was developed, but there's actually there's apartment townhouse housing, some of it very old, that's located just adjacent to it to the south. So The Ponds was bought second. It was built second. Those were built first. Therefore, the higher density housing was already there before the single family housing comes in. So my point is, Fort Collins, for example, has a major area to develop is to the northeast, where there isn't a lot of development. There is some, but not a lot. So I thought having some push to try to do affordable projects where there's hardly anybody around is the place to really start doing them, with some transit being extended. So you get over the NIMBY piece and you get into a place where you might be able to do something, and a place that's going to have potentially higher density for how you do it. The other point I'd make is your model, or coming this at a state level for college towns, for the accessory dwelling unit, the TOD, and the medium density housing requirement, you're going into a hornet's nest. College towns have different issues than just communities that don't have a large student population with lots of renters. And the accessory dwelling units in Fort Collins would be a controversial project topic, but maybe you can get it through at the state level. But I'm saying, I just don't think that's the way to approach things. I think Sean's point of figuring out the how is important. The other one, reducing parking. Well, all the time developers want parking reduced. We've seen it in Fort Collins, and what happens, the interim period between now and when people will be using more alternative transportation, you get folks just pushed into the neighborhoods. I mean, the neighborhoods, so then we have to go to some sort of restricted parking in the neighborhoods with permits. And in the short term, there's a tremendous problem. In 10 years, maybe there won't be, but in the short term it is. Anyway, those are some thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. Appreciate that.
So I don't see anybody else's hands up, so I'm going to just jump in real quick. Just one comment relative to the inclusionary zoning, and that is most inclusionary zoning ordinances prescribe a percentage of housing at various income levels. So they're equating those two. So 20% of the housing units have to be targeted to households that are below 60% median income, or whatever that might be. The challenge, though, is that I think most communities along the Front Range in particular already have a significant deficit. And so the fear that I have with well, a number of them, but the biggest one I have with inclusionary would be that a community says, okay, we're going to adopt it, and now we want to see 25% of all your units targeting households that are at, again, 80, 60, you pick the number. But that doesn't equate to the percentage of households in the community that fit that income level, right? So if you follow my math, at 100% of median income, roughly 50% of all households are earning less than 50%, and 50% of households are earning more. So unless you have an inclusionary zoning that says 50% of all units have to be affordable to households that are below 100%, you're really just cementing that that divide between the availability of housing according to what folks' household income is. And it becomes, I think, a cruel tool in that regard, in that you give the impression to the community that you're addressing the problem, that you're implementing this policy that's going to help us start to address the problem, when in fact you're making the problem worse if your requirement is less than what the actual community makeup looks like. So I don't know if you want to talk about that. I mean, obviously there's other concerns that I have with inclusionary, but that's the one that just it doesn't compute with me, because it doesn't make sense just on a straight math perspective.
Brian, I'll start,
Yeah.
and then I'll turn it over to you. We're doing some economic feasibility in Denver right now to help them think about. Started with looking at densities incentives. They had a pilot program in the Rhino neighborhood, 38th and Blake, that didn't really return a lot of units, and so we're helping them rethink. How do the economics work behind this, and are doing a lot of developer interviews. So just to kind of give you, play a little bit of devil's advocate, sort of on the ground, like the Denver experience, which I Denver's a unique animal in this regard, but I don't think it's outside of the, realm of possibility to see this take shape in other communities. The way it's working in Denver right now is that if you want a rezone, there's a heavy negotiation in terms of affordability. Sometimes neighborhood groups get really involved in that. And Joe, you're right in that, the need tends to be in almost every community that 0 to 30% or 0 to 50% AMI level. So that's 0 to 30% is equivalent to poverty. And that's where we see the greatest need, because the federal government stopped playing in that realm many decades ago. Public housing has its problems, but it did provide housing for people at that, in poverty. And when we stopped building that, and then as funds have declined, there are very, very few resources to address those needs. So I don't think that we are saying that inclusionary zoning is the solution. What happens in a community like Denver when it's a negotiated aspect of a rezone is that you have very, low transparency in terms of what does the city expect, what's city council going to expect, where should we set our rents, what's our affordable contribution. And so developers have told us that they would welcome some kind of transparency, and that, be happy even if it was mandatory as opposed to, negotiated. They say we're being told to jump, but we don't know how high until we get to that city council meeting. And that costs a lot more money than a transparent system, either an incentive system or inclusionary system. So I think transparency really is key. And when you look at the economic modeling, introducing some relief in that 60 to 80% AMI level, that's the place where the public sector typically is not providing subsidies. They tend to operate, at that lower income level, and it's not where the private sector is necessarily operating anymore, because we've lost a lot of units there. So it's all to say this is just one part of a toolkit, and I would be concerned if there is, and I think we see this in many communities in the country, this idea that inclusionary zoning will solve everything, and that then you don't have to invest, in other aspects of your affordable housing needs. And we certainly would not say that that's the case. But I think there are a lot of risks. And part of our platform, as Brian talked about, is getting inclusionary zoning right, is certainly what we would support.
Yeah, and I would just add too that I think, we get the question a lot about, the 8 proposals, is there a favorite child of them, or is there ones that we drop? I mean, we view it as a package deal, right? And so if you're going to address the supply of affordable housing through an inclusionary ordinance, that should not be the only tool you're using, right? I mean, they look, and I mean, the inclusionary ordinance itself, I think, having the offsets is important. I mean, things that we talked about and that ideas that we've offered up on the bill are, range from density bonuses, or, permitting expediting, or, even going to as far as local government providing infrastructure. I mean, a lot of these projects, not only might they be required to provide affordable units, they're providing all the infrastructure to serve the project, or they're providing all the infrastructure to serve the neighborhood, right? So it's a bigger package deal than just the inclusionary housing bill. And I think the fear that I think some of us have, and rightfully so, is the inclusionary housing bill should not be the end of the discussion, right? This year, we're going to get the inclusionary housing bill, likely. Maybe there'll be some amendments to it, maybe there won't be. But once we have that, the discussion is not over, right? That there needs to be a lot more on the back end to facilitate the development of housing.
Thank you. Are there other questions? I don't see anybody else's hand up. So I'll give you one last opportunity to
And Joe,
weigh in.
while you're waiting, I just wanted to make a comment, kind of piggybacking on what Jerry had said. So I live in a community in Denver that is, it's a repurposing of defense property, meaning that 30% of our units had to be affordable before the market rate units were allowed to go in. And as we've looked at like these large development areas and redevelopment throughout the country, I do 100% agree with you, Jerry, that having, the first in when you've got a large development area, first in of affordable really does make a big difference. And in this case, we've been studying a development in the Oakland area in California, which is also Department of Defense property, and will have that 30% contribution right out of the gate. Now it's easier to do because you're repurposing existing units, right? So you're not building new, you've got the infrastructure laid for the most part. But I think that you can think about that, or to keep that in mind when you're looking at the disappearance of naturally occurring affordable housing in markets too. Not only is preserving NOAA really efficient, and there's some state conversations within the State Division of Housing about how could we help support preservation of naturally occurring affordable housing, which is getting lost in all of our communities. But it's already built, so it's got efficiency there, and it's less subject to NIMBYism because it's already built. There's a lot of advantages of that. So I think preservation it's not something that we're advocating as part of our platform, but it's got to be part of everybody's toolkit.
Great, thanks, Heidi. Mr. Horak?
Yeah, just a response to that or question. So how have you looked at, or how do mobile home parks fit in? Because in most communities, they are the most affordable housing.
I know our colleague Don Elliott's done some work in your areas associated with mobile home parks. We've done some facilitation in Aurora. Aurora's got the Denver Meadows, very sad experience with people, I think, who will be displaced when the park sells. It's a tough one, because in the best case scenario, and there's a couple examples of this in Boulder, the residents are able to buy the units, and there's maybe some public contribution in terms of infrastructure, which you can use with the community development block grant to support those communities they're low income, which they always likely are. So you can, if you can achieve some kind of like public sector ownership, public housing ownership, I think that's exists in Steamboat, or resident owned community, that's the best case scenario. In a market like ours, though, the developer is very incentivized to sell it for redevelopment and just raise the price, which happened with the Denver Meadows Park in Aurora. He just kept raising it so that the public sector couldn't purchase. It was just out of the realm of possibility. In the state of Oregon, and I'm not completely up to speed on this because it's been a couple years since I looked at it. I know that Bend, Oregon requires a set aside, an affordable housing set aside for redeveloped parks. And that's been their solution. And that may have come from a state ordinance. I just can't recall at this point. It's a tough one.
Great. Any other questions from our guests? Seeing none. Brian, Heidi, thank you very much for taking the time to share this with us. And we have your presentation, and this is being recorded, so we'll have this available for reference later on. But welcome the opportunity to provide some feedback as folks go back to their office and think about it. I think Brian and Heidi have both expressed interest in getting feedback. If you have something constructive that can help the cause, we'd invite you to do that. And we'll make sure that your contact information gets shared as well. So,
Yeah, thanks so
Hey,
much.
Joe. Hey, Joe, before Brian and Heidi take off here, I just wanted to thank both of you for presenting today. We really appreciate your insights and passion around this topic. A member of this working group who's not on the call today, but who I'll make a personal introduction to both of you, is our planning director, Brad Mueller. I'm the director for economic health and housing. So we come at this challenge from a little bit different vantage points, which is really powerful for what we're doing in Greeley. So I'll stay engaged, but I just wanted to thank you both and let you know I'll be making an introduction to Brad Mueller with regard to Greeley's strategic housing plan that we just adopted at City Council a couple of years ago. I conveyed to developers that Greeley is in an exceptionally positive, creative, and flexible mood as it pertains to this thorny issue. And that's been a welcome sound from a lot of the developers that I'm talking to, whether they're affordable or market rate, it really doesn't matter. They're really enthused by that, what we've done here in Greeley. So while Brad tackles the regulatory side of it, they're doing some development code updates right now and doing presentations to council. So this is very timely. I'm working on the other side, which is sort of the marketing component to this, develop these relationships with partners who maybe don't know Greeley's in this flexible and creative mood right now. So thank you again, and be on the lookout for that intro to Brad.
Thanks, much appreciated.
Mr. Horick, did you have something else to
Just
add?
one more. I don't know if you've reached out, or I'd just suggest you try to get on as one of the presentations at the Colorado Municipal League and the Colorado counties when they hold.
Yeah,
because I think that's where you really hit your audience for trying to think about it, or if you want feedback, that's where you get it.
Yeah, Jerry, we've been in contact with both of them and have spoken to them.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much. Again, you're welcome to stay if you would like to hear from our friend Kelly Evans, who is reporting live from the Utah desert, as I understand it, giving us an update on Neighbor to Neighbor and their programs that are assisting households that are facing foreclosure or eviction. So Kelly, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. And thank you so much to the friends that we're making at CHAP. I'm so encouraged to have that data. And I think sometimes when you're on the front lines, it is just really helpful to be able to come up and get this toolkit. So thanks again. And thanks, Joe, for bringing them to us. So Neighbor to Neighbor, quick update. We obviously are the eviction prevention provider for Larimer County. And until recently, we're also the primary provider of eviction prevention work for Weld County. And now Weld County is operating their own program. So that's going to help, I think, considerably. To give you a little bit of sense of kind of what's happened over the last year, before the pandemic hit, Neighbor to Neighbor would distribute about $20,000 per month in rent assistance. to Larimer County households. And that steadily grew to the point that now we are at a monthly average of $1 million in eviction prevention distribution, still to both Larimer and Weld counties. I suspect that we will be at $1 million distribution every month for all of 2021, even as Weld County's program continues and grows, because we just have so many waiting households right now. So the bad news I'm sharing, in case you have property and have tenants potentially waiting for neighbor-to-neighbor assistance, is our wait right now is really long. It's embarrassingly over 6 weeks. And at the same time, once people do get through and get to a housing coordinator, we are able to provide a lot of rent assistance in one fell swoop. So we do believe that the wait times are going to start going down. Starting in January, we were able to provide all back rent, current month, plus 2 future months. So thankfully, even though we do have an average of about 1,100 households pending constantly, it feels like, that should start to decrease as households receive, at least a quarter's worth of rent assistance at one time. Also, the Weld County program is going, so that's going to help us. And then also we doubled our frontline team just recently. So we have a lot more housing coordinators in place. And of course, we had done that along the way, but suddenly in January, everybody applied, I feel like, in January. So updates you may have seen, I'm not sure how much press has been out yet about Larimer County receiving the ERAP grant. Also, that is the same funding that Weld County received. Both counties received roughly $10 million. I think Weld's was a little bit below that and Larimer's was a little bit above that, for rent and utility assistance. And that is from the Treasury. That is before this latest round of stimulus. So there might be another one of those, but currently Neighbor to Neighbor is contracted with Larimer County to distribute those funds in rent and utility assistance, which is very helpful because it's going to fill the gap that is soon left by the EHAP program. We're going to be out of those funds in the next couple of weeks. So long story short, we're looking good at continuing to have funding to provide high levels of rent assistance, because while some of us, we haven't maybe been impacted economically too much by this pandemic, some households and obviously very many businesses are just maybe never going to recover. So we have a lot of folks in very stressed situations waiting on this assistance. So that's about it on rent assistance. The eviction moratorium is currently scheduled to end in about 2 weeks. So that's added a layer of stress, certainly. And I don't know if that will get extended again. When it's been extended in the past, it's been at the last minute. The forbearances for mortgages are also still largely in place, but some of those are going to drop off at the end of April with some options to extend. So that could help folks. With the forbearances, thankfully, those loans have been pushed out. So those households are typically not needing to come up with all of their back mortgage payments at once. Whereas with renters, they are expected to come up with all of their back rent. There's not really a way to push rent payments out. You still have to pay it. So that's pretty much what we're up to. We do still have some funding for mortgage assistance, but it is dwindling. So at that point, I think if anybody has questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Mr.
Horak?
Yes, I just want to, how do people find you or you find them?
It's largely online, intowin.org, and there are 2 tabs at the top, one in Spanish and one in English, around apply for rent assistance. So that's the easiest way. And if they can't, they can call Neighbor to Neighbor, and we can take their intake over the phone in Spanish or in English.
Do you have any idea then of what part of the need that you're fulfilling, of the 100% of the people who would need this, what percent is actually getting it?
I don't know how I would know that. We take what comes at us and manage it the best we can. Certainly, we suspected we weren't addressing the entire need through November, because our numbers, while high to us, they were, tiny compared to the percent of population. We're assisting about 500 households per month, if that gives you a sense. It's still not a huge sector of the population.
And the last one is are the additional folks that you hired, are they part of that money, or are they in addition to?
Well, we're using these large grants to pay them. Does that answer your question?
You said of the $1 million going out each month.
Oh, no, that's direct assistance.
Okay.
Yeah, great question. Yeah.
How much is that costing for the additional people?
You know, people to do this work, they're not all that expensive. $19 an hour times each person plus benefits. So thankfully with these large grants, they do build in 10% admin. But what I was sharing today was just the direct assistance out the door.
It just seems like it's at some day in the future, the cliff is going to happen.
Whenever the eviction moratorium ends, it will be very bad. And I was never a huge fan of the eviction moratorium for this long, because we really have allowed folks to run up really high debt. Not that they really had a lot of options if they don't have income. But yeah, we're just trying to get through as many as we can because we have cash. It just takes a minute to get through this backlog.
Well, thanks a lot.
So Kelly, if you don't mind my asking, the $1 million that's going out, and you said that up to the end of January, I think you said was Larimer and Weld, but you're thinking that Larimer and Weld are both going to have $1 million a month going out separately?
I don't know what Weld's distribution will be. I do know that we both counties received healthy allocations from the Treasury. And in order to spend that money down by the end of calendar year 2021, we'll need to be at about $1 million a month. We already are. Their program is new, so I'm not sure what their distribution is, but I'm sure they'll be ramping it up to that point.
And is that the distributions, is that for both rent and mortgage assistance, or is it?
It is. It is.
What's that breakout look like?
I mean, gosh.
Half of it rent, half of it mortgage, or is it?
At least 95% rent.
Okay.
Because most mortgages have enjoyed deferments, and we are not assisting in that scenario. There are just a tiny bit of scenarios where we can assist with mortgage assistance, honestly. And then coming up with this new round of money that Weld is already distributing, utility assistance will be included.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. So no, I assumed you're only assisting those that don't have a government-backed mortgage.
Correct. Or any other deferment.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Other questions for Kelly before she gets back on her motorbike and tears it up? And you are tearing it up out there, aren't you, Kelly?
Totally. You should see me.
For those
Kelly,
of you who know that Kelly had a wild side, now you get a glimpse of it.
Yeah. Oh, hey, Sue Beck-Frickus.
Hi, my camera seems to be missing in action, but so when you start to include utilities, are you coordinating with the city's utility program? Because I know that they're really trying to help with assistance as well.
Yeah, Jamie Gaskill has been wanting to meet with me for weeks, and we're going to meet next week because I haven't been ready to distribute the funds yet or really think about that yet. But starting next week, we have a ton of meetings with both utility providers and utility assistance providers. Since Neighbor to Neighbor is new in this game, we want to just make sure everybody knows what a good referral is for this assistance, and we know that we have good relationships with the utility providers to quickly process this.
Wonderful, and Jamie's just the right person, so thanks,
Yeah,
Kelly.
She's excited.
Great. Any other questions, comments for Kelly, or otherwise just general comments? Feedback? I mean, was this helpful? Do you find the information helpful? Great. I'm seeing at least a couple heads nod.
Although sobering information.
Yeah, that's certainly true. But don't use that word in my presence, Sue. I appreciate it. Any rate, anything else for the good of the cause? And with that, I'll wish you all a happy Friday afternoon. Have a great weekend, and don't throw your back out trying to remove all your trees.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Kelly. See y'all. Have a nice weekend.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.